So luckily, we already have some laws and regulations, which we'll come to in the next section. But in this section, we're still looking at why we need laws, why we need to take action. From the existing data protection and privacy laws, there are actions that can be taken against companies that haven't looked after our data. So let's just take a few European. So here we can see Google. They were fined by the French 50 million euros for their lack of transparency and their policies. H&M out in Germany, monitoring their employees. So you can see that when we look at some of these laws, it's not just necessarily the breaches that we worry about, but it's how that data is used. So in the case of H&M, monitoring the employees, maybe collecting too much information about them. And let's move on to our Italian example, Tim. They were carrying out marketing activities to quite a considerable level. And so you can see it's the data breaches, it's the types of data you might collect. And here we have activities that you might use, tactics that you might use with the data that you've got. And then BA, and if you remember right back to the very first lecture, we talked about BA and its 1 billion exposure to class action, as well as their 22 million euro fine. And Marriott is our last example in this table, and you can see that their story lasted 4 years. So whatever protections and precautions they were taking were not enough to have allowed the continuous activities against them for a period of 4 years. That's quite astounding. And in this next table, we can look at some of the other countries. And we can see that in general, across Europe, data protection agencies have been quite active. And we can see that Italy and Germany come out at top. And I was maybe a little bit surprised to find the UK was halfway down that table. There are consequences, action is being taken as we speak. So now let's wander over to the US. So we spoke about Equifax. So the $575 million was the fine, but the actual class action and the additional consequences takes that up to $1.38 billion. Home Depot, again, this is another long tail activity. They've not been able to arrive at a final figure for the costs because it's still ongoing. And then Uber, that's really interesting. They've suffered from a breach and they've tried to keep it quiet, which probably adds oil to the fire. I'd be most unhappy if my data had been stolen and that I wasn't told. So you can see that business reputations can be really impacted. Now if you're thinking there's a hole on this page, and that hole is a Facebook-sized hole. Don't know about you, but if you go back a few years, do you remember when you saw photos on Facebook and you were asked to tag your photos, your friends, your colleagues? Well, all of that was around facial recognition. So an ongoing dispute over in the States with the state of Illinois, and finally that came to a conclusion with a fine of $650 million for the purpose of harvesting biometrics. So hopefully you can see these consequences are non-trivial. They could be business threatening. They could literally put businesses out of action.